All right, my name's Jeremy Snyder, and I'm here to talk to you today about how to accelerate the adoption of new IAM, that's Identity and Access Management, approaches and technologies. I'm the founder and CEO of Firetail. This is meant to be a 10-minute lightning talk. We've got a lot to get through in 10 minutes, so buckle up. Here we go. Just a little bit about me as we kind of get started here. I started my career as a practitioner in IT ops and cybersecurity, transitioned over into more of the dark side, which is to say kind of customer-facing sales and solutions architecture roles. Went through a number of companies, spent about 5 years working in cloud security, and then the last year and a half in M&A in the cybersecurity space. Currently co-founded Firetail just about 6 months ago with a co-founder of mine. I think to get into why identity and access management is hard, we need to take a minute to think about the history and then consider the current context. So identity and access management is not new. It's something that we've been doing for a long, long time. Users, groups, and roles have existed in those concepts since I started working in IT and cyber ops, and that's back before Active Directory. And Active Directory came around and things like group policy objects really kind of codified this approach. It then kind of gained that name of role-based access control. And frankly, we've been living in a role-based access control powered world for pretty much the entire time since. But I think the question that's most important to think about is that the right model for today? So let's talk about kind of the world that we live in today. It's ironic to me that I'm giving kind of the first keynote talk since 2020 in the very same venue where I gave my last conference presentation in March of 2020. I was just about 20 meters over that way speaking on another stage about cloud security and kind of preaching the mantra of understanding the shared responsibility model. Now, I've taken a photo here from our friends over at Synopsys that I think really illustrates the picture relatively well. What you can see is the different levels of responsibility that you have as the customer and that the cloud service provider or the CSP in this diagram takes. And I think one thing that's really important to understand is that really no matter which model of cloud service you're adopting, SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS, two layers always belong to you as the customer. One is the identity layer and two is the data layer. So some of the questions as we think about the modern world where we've shifted to remote work and everything kind of being remote first and distributed out across a number of cloud platforms is understanding this model and frankly realizing that your org probably has some combination of all flavors of cloud service at this point. And the truth of the matter is we're not going back. We're not going away from these cloud solutions. We've gotten used to them over the last little while. There's obvious cost savings to be had. There's obvious service advantages to be had. And frankly, the shift from on-prem services and all of the work that has to go into maintaining them into shifting some of that responsibility over to the cloud service provider very often makes financial and operational sense for an organization. So we're going to live with this going forward. But one of the challenges it brings is that every flavor of solution by necessity has to have some kind of identity and access management layer. That could be as simple as kind of wiring into a single sign-on and inheriting groups and roles and privileges off of that. But more often than not, it's not. You end up recreating some part of your identity strategy in that cloud service provider environment. And so some of the questions that really rise to mind are, can we ensure that we are doing some of those identity best practices across all of the cloud solutions that we're using? And again, remember that in all of these models, we are responsible for them. We're going to return to a couple of these points when we get into the recommendations towards the end of the presentation. So cloud identity and access management, when we get into kind of the infrastructure as a service layer, brings new layers of complexity that I think a lot of us aren't used to dealing with. So just like we weren't used to dealing with identity stores being outside of our four walls or our control, we now have new layers of complexity. We think about things like AWS accounts or GCP subscriptions. We think about things like resources having identity, and that could be anything from a virtual machine sitting in an AWS network to a policy around some storage application where access to storage is based on group membership or role permissions. And to make it more confusing for people as cyber practitioners, every vendor has their own approach to it. And frankly, in the identity as a service layer, more often than not, creating these policy documents is not a user interface driven task with a nice GUI around it. It often becomes a question of writing JSON policy documents. I took a screenshot from a Slack that I'm in, and I think it really illustrates the point. You can see here the comment is, I seriously consider blowing my brains out whenever I have to deal with the IAM policies. Someone could make a user-friendly policy rolled JSON generator and charge literally anything they wanted for it. So there's this layer of complexity that we're not used to dealing with on the identity side, and that's really making it complex. To kind of illustrate the point, I just took a screenshot of a single call's evaluations for permissions on just AWS. I won't go through all of this, but I think it really highlights just how many layers of complexity there are when we think about cloud identity in the modern context that we're all operating in. And there's been a big push from the vendor community in particular to think about identity as being kind of the new perimeter and the new type of security that we really need to be focusing on. I think that's also causing a lot of confusion. You can find 11 million results just for the phrase identity is the new perimeter. And again, each vendor is going to have their own spin on it, and kind of one size doesn't fit all across the different cloud service providers when it comes to identity, because again, the layers of responsibility are different for each type of solution. One final kind of piece of complexity around cloud identity is that there are proposals out there to move away from RBAC and move into more of an attribute-based access control system. The upside to this is that it's more flexible and it accommodates far more kind of variables and edge cases than simple RBAC. The downside is it's more flexible and it accommodates all of these edge cases and variables. And so you got to think about kind of the balance there as you consider what the right security strategy is for your organization. And that's going to be one of the other things we talk about in the core recommendations for how to make things easier. Final layer of complexity is actually what many estimates show is actually 80% of all traffic across the internet right now is actually API calls, systems talking to systems. And over the last couple of years, my team and I have been tracking the number of data breaches that are happening with APIs as the number one attack surface. And we look at the attack vectors that are being leveraged, and suffice it to say that more than 50% of the attacks really come down to identity-based attacks. The most common being kind of authentication and authorization, typically where authentication is not properly enforced or authorization is not calculated after authentication. So there's an assumption there about authentication and authorization being the same thing, which they are inherently not. So that's something else to keep an eye on. So in summary, why is it so difficult to adopt new identity and access management technologies and strategies? One is this kind of loss of control, where we used to have a single identity store lived on our Active Directory in our data centers or within our four walls. We now have more than 10 across a number of cloud solution providers. And I've validated this number with even small businesses that are not technology companies, and you're finding 12 or more SaaS applications across those companies. Second, the amount of change. Cloud is inherently more flexible in its software-defined nature. That makes it easier to create things, but that also makes it easier to change things. We don't have that same rigorous change management control process that we're used to having, and that throws another layer of complexity into kind of how we look at identity-based security. And then too many competing standards. The fact of the matter is, if you try to centralize all of your identity security into a single place, using IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, and on-prem, or things like Active Directory, it becomes very, very complicating. Secondarily, IAM has become a moneymaker for a lot of vendors in the cybersecurity space. That's either as selling add-on solutions to managing identity, or as kind of a lock-in service where, something like a single sign-on provider really kind of views ownership of that identity layer as being a very firm commitment to a long-term strategy around that. That may or may not be the right thing. That's something to think about. So let's talk about some best practices and some strategies on making it easier. We'll start with kind of cyber hygiene best principles. And, in the cybersecurity world, hygiene is one of these often overlooked very key strategies. And really it comes down to less is more. So things that we don't need or we're not using, let's try to get rid of them. Is there a way we can consolidate down to a single IDP or just a set number of IDPs? That's a great starting point. And if we can't consolidate down, can we at least get visibility into knowing what are all the places where we have identity and where we have identity and permissions defined, so that when that breach happens, we can reduce the number of places, or at least we have a checklist of places that we know to go look for any kind of forensics activity. and then choose a strategy and stick with it. And what I've seen in my work over the last few years in the cloud security space in particular is that organizations tend to work in one of two ways. They either work in kind of a command and control structure where, let's say, one group or a limited number of people can kind of define identity constructs. That might be users, groups, roles, policies, permission sets, what have you. And then it's kind of up to the developers or the people kind of creating applications to align to one of those and to really associate an application to a set of groups or roles or what have you. Or on the other side, it's really more of a kind of let's adopt a more of a cloud first strategy where things might change and people can create things with kind of limited permission sets. And then from the InfoSec side, what we really need is we need ongoing visibility. We need ongoing evaluation of the implications of what's being created in our environments, and then go forward with that. And I think it's really important to make sure that whatever approach you go with matches with your organization's overall culture. I've seen an example a couple of years ago with a customer I was working with on the cloud security side, very large e-commerce organization, where the development team was very much cloud first, cloud native, and they like to change things all the time. But the InfoSec team was very much command and control. And that really led to a situation where once a quarter, they ended up having to shut down all productive work on software development and just issue a set of tasks and then create an identity audit to figure out who could do what where based on which tasks succeeded or failed. So make sure that you've got kind of cultural or organizational alignment with your strategy and then kind of stick with it, because if you change from one to the other, that has big implications for how complete your identity strategy work can be. Then finally, do the basics. We know that in cases like surgical operations or in cases like flight operations, using a simple checklist can eliminate surgical mistakes or reduce the risk of airplane crashes by dramatic percentages. So if we just have a checklist of what we think are our minimum requirements for identity or IAM strategy, and we go down that checklist with every new solution that we incorporate into the organization, we can really improve our visibility, and we can also improve our confidence in our security posture for IAM across those new solutions that we're bringing into our IT estate. And then last but not least, let's remember that users are the people that are actually interacting with identity and access management every day to get their jobs done. So let's make it easier for them to do their jobs. Let's equip them with tools that make it easier for them to align to the IAM strategies that we have rather than trying to go around them. Let's give them things like single sign-on and password managers and really make it easy for them to do their jobs. So hopefully that's been helpful in trying to understand the context of the modern kind of cloud-first world that we live in, why IAM has become so important in terms of securing our organizations, and some thoughts about how we can make an organizational shift towards a very complete strategy and then make it easier for us to adopt new solutions, including the IAM that comes with it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time in watching this presentation.